Hey guys, for today's video, we're discussing the XR Classic. This video is not going to be a teardown video. There are plenty of those already out there. This is a video that's going to address primarily the aftermarket products that we make, as well as the rest of the aftermarket, and how they apply to this new XR Classic. Now, years ago, it was about 10 years back, Future Motion released the V1, and that was a Kickstarter campaign, and that board has the classic, iconic shape that we had come to know and love as a one-wheel. The V1 came out, then the Plus, and then the XR after that. After the XR came out, they released the Pint, which was far smaller. The Pint was good for children, small adults, or just a compact, lightweight board for those that wanted to throw it in a backpack or have something that took up less space, a little bit more nimble. And after that, this goes back about 2.5, 3 years ago, people were putting additional batteries onto their boards for more range. And that seemed to be the trend. In fact, XR stood for extended range, that added range that people were striving for was really the thrust of the aftermarket at the time. Many larger battery pack versions were released, and to that end, Future Motion released the GT. The GT has this form function. This happens to be a GTS, which is the high performance variant of the GT. The GT was released in order to address some of the customers' questions and concerns, mainly regarding range and additional torque. So what they did is they made the thickness of the board far taller at the rear to add a much larger battery pack. And then they thickened the nose of the board just for symmetry, front and rear. That gave you a board that, oh my goodness, if you ride modestly on pavement, I've seen over 30 miles of range on a GT. And even if you're riding aggressively, you're still going to get 15, 16 miles of really hard trail riding, but again, high 20s to low 30s of range on the street. But the GT board was a much larger form factor than the XR was, and much more weight. So to that end, Future Motion has listened to their customers. They wanted to go back to the XR, the classic XR layout, but in a more modern variant. And to that end, they released the XR Classic. I was a little bit kind of leery of this new design on the front end. First off, I thought, well, they're re-releasing the XR. The XR architecture is such that it's simpler than the GT in some ways, but there's issues. Some of the connectors and the way the controller box is assembled and that has been addressed and, in my opinion, improved on the Pint and GT platforms. And so as I began to learn more about the new XR Classic, and once I received my own, my opinion began to change. So you'll see that we've got the original XR Classic rails still on the board, but we've got my billet aluminum beadlock wheel installed, our aluminum foot pads, aluminum deletes, our aluminum foot stops with the 3D printed plastic foot hooks. We call these the toe jams. These are the products that we currently make for the GT that are direct bolt-on to the XR Classic. This XR Classic layout is essentially a GT that they've made a few changes on in order to recapture that look and that form of the original XR. And the primary difference between the XR Classic and the GT would be thickness at the rear. I mentioned previously that in order to add more range to the GT board and more torque, they gave it a larger battery pack, and this broadened the thickness at the tail. Well, that's fine, and myself, many other riders were okay with that, don't have a problem with it. But many people were desiring to have that thinner form factor and didn't necessarily want or need 30 plus miles of range. And so to that end, what they've done is they've taken the GT platform and thinned it back out down to be not exactly as thin, but pretty close to the thickness of the original XR. And they did that by removing some battery capacity. So the range on the XR Classic is several miles down from a GT, but it's still several miles longer than the original XR of several years ago. In fact, you'll notice that the charge port is down exaggerated low within the frame rail. That's because the top section of the battery box is identical to the GT, and the GT charge port was centered in the rails. So when Future Motion reduced the battery capacity, they took that capacity, that size, from the bottom of the battery box, not from the top. So when they pulled the bottom of the battery box up in order to give a shorter profile rail, that exaggerated the charge port down to the lower portion of the rail. So here we have an original XR frame rail. Here we have a later model GT frame rail. This is from a GTS, but the GT and GTS are identical mechanically and dimensions in every way. And you can see that there is quite a height difference between the two. It's about a ½ inch of height difference. And in fact, the XR rail will fit completely inside of a GT rail without a problem at all. So there's quite a height difference there. And I'll lay this over the top of the XR Classic, and you'll notice that the charge port is lined up through the GT or GTS profile rail and where the charge port is on the XR Classic. But since they've removed height from the bottom of the rail and the bottom of the battery box, keeping the charge port located where it was meant that it's now at the bottom portion of the rail. There's an industry term, parts bin technology. That basically means, what do you already manufacture that you could apply to a new design? And what they've essentially done is taken the controller module, the battery, for the most part, other than shortening the box and reducing the capacity, the wiring, the motor, the foot pads, the deletes, and they've moved that all over to this new XR Classic platform. So here I've got a GT battery and controller module assembly. This is from one of the first GTs I had purchased. And the controller box module, and I believe the controller circuit board assembly, are absolutely identical between a GT and an XR Classic. There are some minor firmware changes. If you go into the app, there are some things that appear slightly different, but mechanically the box is the same and the circuit board appears identical in every way, and as does the battery, the BMS, the box, except for being shorter and lesser capacity internally. This is actually a brilliant move on Future Motion's part, both in marketing and for production. Whenever possible, it's best to keep a product line relatively consistent. It means less product development time, much easier production, manufacturing, serviceability, replacement parts, just every aspect of the product cycle, the production and service cycle, really is better suited by taking components that you already manufacture and applying them to a new design board. As far as I can see, when I disassembled my XR Classic to install my aftermarket parts, there are 3 primary differences between the XR Classic and the GT. The main thing, obviously, are the frame rails. The frame rails are much shorter, and they have a different interior depth than the GT does. That shorter profile was really to give it that XR Classic look, and also, again, to accommodate the smaller battery pack. So that the rails are one primary difference. The second difference, and these differences that I'm pointing out are related to those of us in the aftermarket and things that you can take from a GT or GTS and directly move them over to the XR Classic. So we have the frame rails, we've got the bumpers, front and rear. Being that the profile is a different height, the bumpers, the molding of the bumpers is completely different. You cannot use XR Classic bumpers on a GT and vice versa. They will not work. The front bumpers have 2 additional holes, but the primary thing is the height difference. So they're a completely different bumper. So you've got different bumpers, different frame rails, and then the battery. Everything else moves completely over from the GT to the XR Classic platform. Now, the XR Classic is far less expensive, and the GT was an expensive board, the GTS even more expensive, and customers wanted the Classic look at a lower price point, and so the XR Classic, this one was $1,900. You can also get it with their recurve rails for a few hundred more, and that lower cost, they changed, again, the capacity of the battery. That saves some money, but also the motor, which is within the wheel, has changed, but not in form. In form, it's identical to what they already make in their replacement 6-inch motor, which is 6-inch wheel and tire and stator assembly. My assumption is that there are some internal differences to ease the cost of manufacture. This particular XR Classic actually has my billet wheel, but it also has a GTS stator. If you go on Future Motion's website, they list the GTS motor and stator assembly as a direct bolt-on to the XR Classic, but they list it as an upgrade. So potentially stronger magnets, maybe the KV of the winding of the armature could be a little bit different, which is the stator inside the motor. I personally couldn't feel the difference between the stock XR Classic wheel and motor assembly versus the GTS. But admittedly, I didn't do enough riding to get a real good solid comparison there. So the aftermarket, it looks like any aftermarket wheel that you would like to install, or tire, foot pads, deletes, footholds, all of that should cross directly over. I would say there are 3 things that you cannot use. Existing frame rails, axle carriers, and bumpers aren't made for this board yet, but I will say this. All of the GT components will cross over, in that if you want to put GT rails onto this board, you can. However, you need to use GT axle carriers and GT bumpers, front and rear. And I'm sure many people will go that route, but with a narrower battery, now you have about 3/8 of an inch to maybe a 1/2 inch of dead space between the battery and the bumper at the rear. And so if you want the added ground clearance, that's not necessarily the best way to go. But again, GT rails, bumpers, axle carriers can be put on this board, and it'll look just like a GT or a GTS. Now, why do you need different axle carriers? There are 2 main differences between these axle carriers and the GT. First off, you have this offset. You'll notice that they lowered the board down several millimeters, and what that does is it moves the location of the axle screws up in the rail. So they had to offset those holes also in the axle carriers to make the axle carriers fit within the frame rail. However, there's a couple other subtle differences, and that is rail depth. The depth between the edge of the rail and the face of the inside of the rail where the axle carrier would lie, there is additional depth on the XR Classic versus the GT. Another thing is there is around a millimeter and a half of additional width on the GT, between the GT rails, top and bottom, versus the XR Classic. So GT carriers won't fit within these rails. Again, the depth is wrong and the height is wrong, and the screw offset is different. Right now, what we're doing is we're in the process of designing rails, obviously, but also new axle carriers. What we don't want to do is have to make a set of axle carriers for the GT and GTS variant and a set of axle carriers for the XR Classic. So what we're trying to do is, and I think I have the solution to this, is to make a slight design revision to our ice block axle carriers to work with the XR Classic platform and with the GT platform. And I believe there are a couple minor changes I can make which will allow that one carrier to work with both platforms. So those are the main things that we're looking at here. If you have an XR Classic, I can tell you that any aftermarket wheel, either that we make or the Float Life makes, will fit directly on. Any foot pad from any manufacturer, fender deletes, I know flight fins will fit directly on as well. All of these components should fit directly onto your XR Classic. And again, if you want to use GT or GTS rails, you're welcome to do that. You just need to make sure that you order GT or GTS bumpers and axle carriers to adapt those GT rails to the XR Classic. So in closing, my opinion of this board is actually quite good. What they've done is they've given the buying public really what they've been asking for. Future Motion comes under fire by people for various things, and I think every corporation does at times. But ultimately what they've done is they've given the buying public an option that they've been asking for. People have been asking Future Motion to go back to this more classic, hence the name, frame rail design, lower cost, lighter weight, and just a slimmer profile. So that's what they've done, but they've done it in a way to introduce the more modern electronics and firmware into this more classic design. And they've done it in a way to lower cost. And I guess that's the one last thing that I want to point out is that the GT and GTS platform, the rails are profile machined. They're not flat. Now, these rails are not cast aluminum like a lot of people assume. They are actually CNC machined, and that requires contour machining of the side profile of these rails. And it gives it a nice organic look, but that is very expensive. Trust me, from a manufacturing standpoint, these rails are expensive to manufacture. These squared off profile rails, very, very simple to manufacture. Much quicker, much simpler than this contour machine. In fact, I'm betting probably half the manufacturing time to make flat profile rails like this versus the contoured rails, or at least a substantial reduction anyway in manufacturing time. So between that, more basic internals of the motor is what I'm assuming for lower cost, as well as a smaller battery, these things allowed Future Motion to drop the price down. So what they've now given the buying public is what they want: lighter board, lower cost, more classic look, and yet compatible with the vast majority of Future Motion's own upgrades and third-party aftermarket upgrades that are already available. So I think that's it for me for today. Please leave a comment in the comments section below. Let me know if there's any other videos that you'd like to see. We've got a video just on our toe jams, footholds coming up here soon, as well as some other things in the pipeline. So thanks, guys.